And in recognition of that, we asked the audience to wear hats. So that is all in honor of you. It is.
Fancy some of them. Keep your hands tightly on them.
We asked them to wear hats in honor of your 10th anniversary of lecturing at summer school.
Yeah, put it there. No, I just put it on. Yes, come on.
Sorry, it's still my hands up. Can I just... There we go.
And is it loud enough?
Should be loud.
Okay, is this loud enough? No. Good. Is this loud enough? Bit more? Yes? Bit more? Bit more? Good. Even if it sounds like an echo to me. I feel I'm in one of those large tiled lavatories, you know? Well, I wanted to start today by saying that we had an email this morning from TTE, as he calls himself. Too loud. It's too echo, isn't it? We had an email this morning wishing us luck in our lecture, which of course makes every lecturer quake in their shoes. And I hope, you know, I've already met 2 people who have taught him in the past, very eminent people who have taught him in the past. I'm already terrified. It was Virginia Woolf's birthday yesterday, incidentally. And we should have been talking about Virginia Woolf. If I hadn't been so stupid, we'd have been talking about Virginia Woolf yesterday. So anyway, I thought I'd just add that to the general mix. And I also asked Tan, as I shall call him, his surname, I also asked him about another book. I said, everybody I have talked to who has read your book is absolutely impatient for another one. And he said this morning, won't tell me everything, but he did tell me this. He said, I am working on my 3rd book now in Malaysia. I didn't think I'd quite risk saying, what's it about? But I think, you know, I think South Africa will come in again. And it was here, of course, that he wrote The Garden of Evening Mists, first, yes. So isn't that lovely? Isn't that exciting to think that you own that book? It all makes me feel much worse about myself, of course, daring to say anything. I mean, such a wonderful book, and how can one do it justice in what is now less than an hour? My choice of poem has been dictated to a large extent by Tan himself. His own brilliant selection of Shelley's The Cloud in the book to reflect what he sees as the beauty and joy and miracle of a garden, of whatever kind. And several are described in his novel as he attempts to pinpoint what it is, and one of them is very much a South African garden, imported by Magnus to the Cameron uplands, tealands, which we'll see in a minute. So here is The Cloud by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I'm just reading you the first stanza and the last stanza. I bring fresh showers for the thirsting flowers from the seas and streams. Have you got it? Extract 1. I'll start again. I bring fresh showers for the thirsting flowers from the seas and the streams. I bear light shade for the leaves when laid in their noonday dreams. From my wings I shaken the dews that waken the sweet buds, every one, when rocked to rest on their mother's breast as she dances about the sun. I wield the flail of the lashing hail and whiten the green plains under. And then again I dissolve it in rain and laugh as I pass in thunder. I am the daughter of earth and water and the nursling of the sky. I pass through the pores of the ocean and shores. I change, but I cannot die. For after the rain, when with never a stain, the pavilion of heaven is bare, and the winds and sunbeams with their convex gleams build up the blue dome of air. I silently laugh at my own cenotaph, and out of the caverns of rain, like a child from the womb, like a ghost from the tomb, I arise and unbuild it again. Terrible poem to read to you, of course, at this time, isn't it? All that rain and all those clouds. I'm sorry about that. The Garden of Evening Mists, as you probably know, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It should have won it, of course. Won the Pan-Asian Booker Prize and the Walter Scott Memorial. It's a historical fiction prize in competition with no less a writer than Hilary Mantel. So it's got a pretty good pedigree, I'd say. It's beautifully written and superbly plotted. I was fascinated to learn that it really hadn't started out with the plot it now has. Well, the plot, the basics of the plot, but the order of it. Twan, here in this building, probably, was writing down all his thoughts about what he wanted to go into the book, because he answered all the questions I sent him, so I know all this in detail, actually, too much detail. And he said that he was happy to have all the material, but he realized it was in the wrong order. For example, the most shocking material in the book, that time in the POW camp, the Japanese prisoner of war camp, which came originally in chapter 3, was moved to chapter 19 of about 26 chapters. A quite deliberate move, because he said he realized he didn't want to let the air out of the balloon too soon. And I think he was absolutely right. And when it is described, you realize with what restraint it's described. It's very, very restrained. It's obviously such shocking material that he doesn't think you need quite as many details as perhaps you would have expected. And there is a connection between him writing the book, in his mind anyway, and gardens, because as the Chinese protagonist Yunling remarks to her Japanese lover Aritomo, and these are Tan's own words on Japanese gardens, writing a novel is similar to designing and creating a Japanese garden. Both arts require artifice and lies. You probably won't agree with that, those of you who are thinking of something more natural. But I think it's one of those contradictions we've been discussing all week, the fact that a garden is a natural thing, i.e. imitating the natural world to some extent, but is also highly artificial because it is plotted and planned. Every single object in the garden, he writes, is carefully selected and placed to create the optimal effect. The same with words and sentences in a work of fiction. For a novel and a garden to succeed, the lie has to convince, to beguile. Like a gardener, the writer must create a believable world. Yunling realizes this when she leads a group of visitors through that wonderful Japanese garden, Yugiri, which has been created by Aritomo. The turns in the track, she writes, disoriented not only our sense of direction, but also our memories. And within minutes, I could almost imagine that we had forgotten the world from which we had just come. I have a friend who's created something fairly similar to a Japanese garden. I always feel lost. It's a tiny plot, and yet, because of the way in which she has created this. In a similar way, I think Tan realized that the need to use his material to the greatest effect. I think that's where the idea of artifice comes in. And so he moved that section. And the result in this book, which is quite a complex plot, is, to quote the Asian Review of Books, a good old-fashioned story. I suppose I'm rather old-fashioned. I like a story. A good old-fashioned story with a plot that arcs gracefully, maintains suspense, and stays true to characterization. And I think that's something that one can't take for granted in a modern novel. The action of the book is spread across 3 focal time points. The first one, of course, is the Japanese prisoner of war camps. And as you know, this was a period which started very dramatically in December the 7th, 1941 with the Japanese attack on the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. And the English always scratch their heads and say, well, what on earth made the Japanese do it? I mean, it seemed like suicide, didn't it? In retrospect, for the Japanese, it was to prevent the US naval fleet dominating the seas. And it wasn't own goal, of course, because it was the reason why the Americans finally agreed to join the Allies on the British side against the Japanese. In fact, the English declared war on the Japanese only 7 hours before the Americans did. There was a great deal of global ambition in the acquisition of pieces of land on the part of the Japanese. They were going to attack the US-held Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and they wanted to attack the British Empire in Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So there was a plan behind it, a plan which ultimately, but only ultimately, only in 1945 did it really emerge that it was quite impossible to carry it out. The Japanese occupied Malaya until September 1945, and during that period in the book, Yun Ling has spent her time from about 1942 until 1945 in the prisoner of war camp as a young teenager growing up within those terrible conditions and with her sister, her only protection. Tan himself grew up in the shadow of that shadow. It's a shadow that's cast across Malaya in the same way that the Second World War is a shadow which crosses anybody who was born within that period or even afterwards in England. He grew up in that shadow of a shadow then, born only 27 years after the Japanese left Malaysia. He was born in 1972. Yun Ling is imprisoned very near the start of the occupation and is the only survivor, rather like yesterday we were talking about the only Jew to return to Ferrara from the German concentration camps. And it's funny, isn't it, how often the Japanese and the Germans have been compared. And she is the only survivor to walk out of that camp. Her sister is killed there, partly protecting her own little sister, just before the end. This period is rarely described in any detail, unlike the other two periods dealt with, but it is always there. There's a phrase used by the English poet Andrew Motion, talking about one of my war poets, Edward Thomas. I say mine because I wrote a book on him. You'll forgive that. And he said, the war is not the centre, it's not the subject, but it's always there, like a dark metaphorical background. And I would suggest that throughout this book, that period is always there, certainly always there for Yun Ling until the end of her life. There are only two well-defined characters in this. Well, they're not even terribly well-defined, but one of them is Yun Ling's sister, Yun Hong, and Tominaga Noboru, I've probably mispronounced it, who becomes Yun Ling's protector and helps her to escape in the end. Tominaga is also a link forward to the next period, 1951, when Yun Ling herself meets the Japanese gardener, the Japanese whom, as you'll see, she absolutely hates to the depths of her soul. So that second period, 1951, this period described in far more detail in what you might call the heart of the book. For Yun Ling, having escaped from the POW camp, wants her revenge. She comes back, goes back to her family, goes to Girton College, Cambridge, studies law. There's quite a lot of autobiographical detail here, and then comes back to serve on the war tribunals, admitting quite honestly, in order to get her revenge on the Japanese if she can, and also to find out where she was imprisoned in the camps. But after she resigns, finally, she decides it's now time to have a garden built. And this is the deep irony at the centre of the book. The garden she has to build has to be a Japanese garden, because her sister was a great admirer of Japanese gardens. And the only man who can do it, who knows how to create this Japanese garden, is the friend of a friend of her father's who lives in the Cameron Highlands. So you've got Kuala Lumpur, that's the first arrow, where she is working now as a lawyer, the Cameron Highlands above it, and Penang, where she originally came from, in the top left-hand corner. So ironically then, it is a Japanese to whom she goes for that garden in memory of her sister. And she finds him through the South African Magnus. I love it. I thought it was so nice when I discovered there was a nice South... Well, I did get the tip about the book from a South African friend who was sitting in the audience. So Yun Ling travels from Kuala Lumpur, where she's been working, to the Cameron Highlands, where Magnus, the friend of the family, owns a tea plantation. Malaysia is the most beautiful country I've ever been to, bar none, and I think the tea plantations are quite wonderful. So Magnus puts her in touch then with Aritomo. Magnus himself is an ex-prisoner of war from the British concentration camps in the Boer War, which of course is very salutary for somebody like myself who's been taught a sanitized version of British history. And just as Yun Ling has lost 2 fingers of her left hand, chopped off in the POW camp, so Magnus has lost one of his eyes in that same situation. I think both of them are very tough. To survive prisoner of war camp, you have to be either very lucky or very tough, or both. He lives with his Chinese wife, Magnus, on a tea plantation he runs successfully in a South African-style house, surrounded by a garden, very much in the English, or at least European style. And later on, there'll be an interesting debate between them about, well, not between Magnus, but between his nephew and Yun Ling, about the virtues of the indigenous garden, which always gets me rather puzzled when I come here. We don't have that discussion in England very much. But then we have more water than you do. It was sparked off, apparently, by a meeting with an actual gardener of the Emperor of Japan in Johannesburg. And I like that. That's just such a nice little touch, isn't it? Something that really started him thinking about who could be a worthy antagonist to Yun Ling. During the first half of the book, Yun Ling visits Aritomo and offers to pay him to make her a Japanese garden, and he takes great pleasure in saying, I have no intention of making you a Japanese garden, but if you're very nice to me, you can become my apprentice, and I will teach you how to make your own Japanese garden. You can imagine how she feels hating the Japanese as she does. He allows her to become his apprentice, and she has no choice. And despite her extreme hatred of the Japanese, she finally agrees and finds herself doing the most humiliating of work. She finds herself lifting rocks, straining to help the labourers lift the rocks, and also, and I did actually find from the student who was helping me, she'd been to Japan, and she said, I found a garden in Kyoto that I liked very much. Look, it's got the rocks. I said, well, perhaps you knew that 2 years later I would be doing this. I like to think like that, don't you? Eventually the two become lovers. That's a really nice little twist to the plot. And besides teaching her gardening, Aritomo shows her his beautiful woodblock printings, because Aritomo is an artist, not just in the garden, but in printing, and also in the art, the Japanese art of horimono, which is a very posh word for tattooing. It's creating a picture on the surface of the skin, usually the back. It's also very hurtful. It hurts. And there's something rather sadistic about this relationship with him giving her the horimono and it hurting intensely, and she becomes addicted to it. It's really quite interesting. I didn't ask too much about that one, but I wondered. 1951 is also, and at the same time, shown to be another period of great conflict as the communist terrorists overrun Malaya. and threaten the life of Yun Ling, among others. It ends with Aritomo, just for reasons not given in the book, walking off into the jungle. And since Tan agreed to answer questions, as long as I didn't ask him what a scene meant, I couldn't really ask, could I? What do you say to somebody when they've given you such a terrible instruction? The third period is 1986. Well, Yun Ling can't stay there, so she goes back to Kuala Lumpur, works hard at being a lawyer, and finally becomes a female judge. And the third period is 1986. She's just retired. Now, I'm telling you this in some detail because unless you know the plot, it's very hard to appreciate how he moves backwards and forwards. In fact, it's quite confusing to begin with, to read that book. And I did ask him, I said, why have you constructed such an elaborate time scheme? Is it to reflect the workings of memory? And he said the elaborate time frame is to accommodate the story I wanted to tell. The fact that it also reflects the twisting corridors of memory was also a factor, since that's how our memory works, isn't it? Not orderly and organized and linear, but jumpy and labyrinthine. I was concerned that the readers would be confused, so I distinguished the past and present by using, well, the past and present tenses. I wanted also to have the effect of echoes. I thought that was a nice observation, the present and the past echoing off each other, and in the process creating more new echoes. Now, the third period, as I say, is 1986 or 7. She's been away, she's become a judge, and she has taken early retirement because she has got aphasia, that terrible condition where you fail gradually or quickly to be able to recognize words, to be able to decipher words. You don't lose your memory. That's one of the cruel things about it. So you know what's happening to you. I mean, when I encounter people whose relatives have Alzheimer's, I always say, well, you know, how conscious are they of it? Because one of the cruelest things of all is to know what is happening to you in that situation. But why aphasia? Well, aphasia because, there's a very nice long answer which we haven't time for, but aphasia because it seemed a particularly cruel condition to give to a person who has spent their life in words, using words. And also, I think, and I think this is rather cunning of him, in order for her to feel obliged to write it down before she loses the power of words. So that's how we get the story, because it's related by Yun Ling. She's expecting a visitor in this period, a man who will add slightly to the complications of what a Japanese character is, what we can expect, what sort of a person, whether they in fact are as unfeeling and cruel as they sometimes appear to her to be. And the visitor is Professor Tatsuji Yoshikawa, who has come to examine the woodblock prints left by Aritomo, the man who so brilliantly created that garden. And they help this man, Tatsuji, and Magnus, the friend, the South African friend, help to widen the context of the book. It takes it out beyond the Garden of Ugiri. Tatsuji goes back in his own story to the period of the Second World War and the last day of the war, when he was a young man and when his lover, a pilot instructor, went out on a kamikaze mission instead of him in order to save his life. So that sort of enriches the plot a little. Why this particular chunk of history? Why 1941 to 1986 or 7? I think this covers the trauma of the Japanese occupation of Malaya and its painful aftermath. I think that for him is one of the most fascinating parts of this period, which lasts in her case until the end of her life. Tan's explanation as an heir to all that, as he puts it, is the occupation was such a huge event. I would say the biggest thing that happened since us being colonized, another slap in the eye for the British in me, of course. But this was a different form of colonization. This was conquest by an alien force. Just imagine you wake up one day and suddenly people say, oh yes, you have to speak Japanese now. It was a huge trauma. And yet so many of my contemporaries in the office, at work, were not interested in it. They said, it's in the past already. A lot of people still think the Japanese invaded from Singapore. Of course, they came in with their bicycles from the East Coast, which was an extraordinary undertaking and very successful. That period of occupation and the next one, 1951, seemed to me also to share another feature which makes them obviously his choice for a purpose, and that is that they are rife with conflict, a lot of it racial. And if you look at the book, there is so much racial conflict in the book, or racial interaction in the book, as you find indeed in Malaysia, which is fascinating partly for that reason. Magnus, a white South African. Yun Ling's father, a straight Chinese. That's the, I haven't got it on the thing, but the Straits of Malacca down that side, the Chinese came and settled on that coast when they wanted to find work, and so they were called the Straits Chinese. Their language, their first language, Tan's first language, is English. He speaks Hokkien, Mandarin, classical Chinese, and Malay, and then came to South Africa to study maritime law with your wonderful faculty here, and found himself learning Afrikaans. So he's a much talented linguist. There's Yun Ling, who hates the Japanese and yet becomes the lover of a Japanese. There's Tominaga, who saves her from death in the POW camp. There's Aritomo. So there are all sorts of different races here. And then there's Magnus and his Chinese wife, Emily, a mixed marriage which meets initially with resistance. It all begins, where does it begin, I said. He said it all begins with the character of Yun Ling, that Chinese, not terribly attractive character in the book, I didn't feel, deliberately so, who arose apparently out of his time as a lawyer in Kuala Lumpur. He was born in 1952, 1972, and then went to school in Kuala Lumpur, grew up, studied law in England, and then finally came here. And you're responsible for this wonderful book. But the thing about being straight Chinese is the fact that they are English-speaking, and that this gives them an audience beyond their language. I mean, it shouldn't be, but English has a privileged position, doesn't it? The straight Chinese also, he says, have been so open to modernization all their lives. They sent their kids to English schools, they educated their daughters, which some Chinese communities didn't. They were very forward-looking. So he had that kind of background. And he became so westernized that apparently, and you've probably heard this joke many times, but in his case it was actually true, that they called him a banana, yellow outside and white in, which of course he says with great relish nowadays. I wonder whether he felt that as a school child. He grew up reading English language books, the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew. And there's a lovely comment, which I thought was really quite typical of him, because he's quite straightforward and sort of speaks his mind fairly easily. He said, I liked Enid Blyton's Five Find Outers. Do any of you know Enid Blyton? Yeah, of course. I grew up on it, I'm afraid. There was one character, Frederick Algernon Trotville, or Fatty. Can you imagine calling a character Fatty, he asks? You'd never get away with it now, but he's such a great character. He was arrogant, a bit of an egoist. Then later, when I was older, I read writers like James Michener and Anna Rice. I saved up my pocket money and bought books. So he's always, besides the law, which of course to those of us who are non-lawyers seems a little dry, he's always been interested in literature. Makes him a good guy, I think. So he then went to London and then came back. But his experience as a lawyer played an important role in shaping the Garden of Evening Mists. Because, he says, Yun Ling is so typical of the women he met in the law at that time. I think it's getting better, but at that time, if you were a female lawyer, you were very much cut off from the rest of the profession. She's cut off from her world and her family because of her experiences in the Second World War, but then as a female judge, she's also very isolated. She's cold, and her job makes this isolation worse. It makes her so lonely. She's also isolated because of her rage. She has this terrible rage in her. And Magnus, the South African, who's been through very similar experiences, says to her, well, it's no good wanting to make a garden while you still feel like that. You cannot create a garden unless you let go of this hatred, which is an interesting thought. He said he had a picture of a woman now old, and I knew something happened to her during the war. What was it? And so it went on from there. Lovely to glimpse of the workings of the novelist's mind. Then, of course, he needed the protagonist to have some worthy opposition, some worthy foil to her. And it was after meeting that Japanese gardener that he started creating character of Aritomo. And, of course, you know, to create a character who knows about woodblock printing, Japanese gardening, and horimono is not something for faint hearts, because if you're a real novelist, you have to go and find out all about that. And when he was asked why a garden, he said, well, really only because of meeting the gardener. He said, I didn't know anything about gardens. He said, I was a city boy. I grew up in Kuala Lumpur. I didn't know anything about gardens until I came to South Africa. He said, and then people would greet each other, not how are you, but how's your garden? And of course that would be particularly true nowadays, wouldn't it, with all the water that we don't put on it. And our guilt if one of our flowers actually blooms is equally bad. And what is also very interesting is that these characters are not simple, straightforward, good, bad characters. They're nuanced. Aritomo is a terribly contradictory character. He's probably part of that Golden Lily operation in the camps, the POW camps, where they stole all the works of art from the countries that they occupied and stored them in order to import them all back to Japan. He probably knew all about that. He may even have been a spy, it is implied in the novel. It's like a really good thriller if you haven't read it. And then eventually it comes out that he's also helped the Malays. He's also saved the lives of quite a number of these people who work for him or work around him. And I suppose he just didn't like the idea of the sort of simple-minded character. He said that he thought we were all flawed and that it wasn't just him inventing flawed characters. So he got his Japanese garden, and he also decided that Aritomo would be the perfect foil for Yun Ling because she hates him so much. So they're together. Now, a Japanese garden, of course, he had to do an awful lot of research. So did I. I still don't know much about Japanese gardens. But I think that what we can say is that the fascination of the Japanese garden is partly its link to Japanese philosophy. So that the garden is reflecting certain principles that the Japanese work on. It's to avoid the artificial, although of course that sounds like a joke to us, doesn't it? It seems highly artificial to me. But you can see that it's trying to look casual, isn't it? It's a bit like your indigenous gardens that you have to dig up your own garden to create. It's the same sort of contradiction, isn't it? And they highlight the natural landscape. So new materials are avoided, old, worn, aged materials are used. Ancient Japanese art inspired the early gardeners. So there's always a sense of creating a canvas. And this use of natural material is to reflect the natural landscape, to express the breakability of existence, and to reflect time's unstoppable advances, all things that will come into the novel itself. Lots of elements, water. If you haven't got any water, this is a good tip for you at the moment. If you haven't got any water, it's got to be represented in the garden, as it is here, of course, in the lake. Then you use white sand. That represents water, carefully, and the Japanese, the stone lanterns and the stones, and all of this is explored in the book in a way that I found quite fascinating. Little bridges, which symbolize the path to paradise and immortality, and all the rest of those wonderful features of Japanese gardens. There's one particular principle of Japanese gardens that plays quite a large part in this book, and that is the borrowing of scenery, shakai or shake. Smaller gardens are often designed to incorporate the view from outside, so you feel it's like putting a mirror in your living room if it's tiny, you know. And of course it's a central scene in the book, that you create the lake that will reflect the outer landscape, and this will in turn give you a much larger and more interesting garden. According to one Japanese historian, well, a Japanese garden historian, David Jung, and his wife Michigo, at the heart of the Japanese garden is the principle that a garden is a work of art. Well, I think that anyway. English, Japanese, whatever, I think a garden should be a work of art. Though inspired by nature, it is an interpretation rather than a copy. All these principles, then, are seen to operate philosophically in the Garden of Evening Mists, in which the garden itself, as Twan points out, becomes a character in the novel. It's something that they react against. The garden interacts with Yunling and Aritomo, he says. It borrows from their emotions and their responses. Yunling and Aritomo, and all who step into that garden, react to the garden in their individual ways. Yugiri, Yunling, and Aritomo are mirrors, reflecting and borrowing from one another. So what is real and what is only a reflection of a reflection of a reflection. But when Frederick's, and he's the nephew of Magnus, remember, when Frederick's local indigenous gardener wants to reduce Ling's ideas about gardens to being all about aesthetics, she's very, very cross. And she says, of course not, she says, and this is extract 6 on your sheets, of course not. The garden has to reach inside you. It should change your heart, sadden it, uplift it. It has to make you appreciate the impermanence of everything in life, I say. That point in time, just as the last leaf is about to drop, as the remaining petal is about to fall, that moment captures everything beautiful and sorrowful about life. Mono no awari, the Japanese call it. And the gardener, who is an indigenous gardener, said, that's a morbid way of looking at life. And Yunling says, we're all dying, day by day, second by second. Every breath that we take drains the limited reserves we are all born with. I can see she's not interested in the subject of death, believing, like so many young people, that it has no relevance to her. And so the gardener leaves and she looks around her. I stand at the edge of the pond and gaze at it after she has left. In my head I hear Aritomo's voice again. Do everything correctly and the garden will remember it for you. And so the garden itself becomes the character in the novel. The introduction of someone who believes in indigenous gardens, adds, of course, to the philosophical interest of the book, particularly at the moment. I found this bit riveting, really, and it's interesting particularly to see where Twan himself stands in this argument, and I think with a very clever evasiveness, I don't think you can say where he stands. He sounds to me to be slightly dubious about the indigenous garden. Frederick has decided then to go indigenous and to pull up his uncle's garden, his English-style garden, with its formal flower beds and its wonderful strelitzias. Frederick stops then says, and this is extract 12, by the way, I've decided to make some changes to Majuba's gardens. That's the house, Majuba's Gardens. And Yunling says, what kind of changes? I've hired a landscape gardener to help me, Frederick says. Vimalia started her gardening service, etc., etc. She's very much a fan of indigenous gardens. Following the trend, I do not bother to sieve the disdain from my voice. His face twitches with annoyance. We're going back to everything nature intended. We're using plants and trees native to the region. We'll let them grow the way they would have done in the wild, with as little human assistance or interference as possible. You're removing all the pine trees in Majuba, she says, and the firs, and the eucalyptuses, the roses, the irises, the strelitzias. So she's very upset by this. And he says, they're alien, all of them. And she replies, so is every single tea bush here. So am I, and so are you, Mr. Pretorius, especially you. It is none of my concern, I know, but for almost 60 years, ever since Frederick's uncle Magnus established Majuba Tea Estate, its formal gardens have been admired and loved. Visitors have been coming from all over the country to enjoy an English garden in the tropics. They walk among the meticulously shaped hedges, voluptuous flower beds, the herbaceous border and the roses Emily planted. It pains me to hear that the garden is to be transformed, made to appear as though it forms part of the tropical rainforest crowding in around us, overgrown and unkempt and lacking any order. And Frederick says, I've told you before, a long time ago, Majuba's gardens are too artificial. The older I get, the more I don't believe in having nature controlled. Trees should be allowed to grow as they please. And then, of course, she thinks afterwards of those amazing bonsai trees, which have been wound with copper to stop them growing and have grown into the most extraordinary miniature shapes. But for Yunling, the narrator, it's not so straightforward. I think that's an interesting debate because you do get both points of view. I think sort of slanted towards the English garden, if I may say so. But Yunling she can't straightforwardly say, yes, we ought to get rid of these things, they're artificial. She looks at her own garden, and at the end of that extract, sparrows rise from the grass into the trees like fallen leaves returning to their branches. I think about those elements of gardening Frederick is opposed to, aspects so loved by the Japanese, the techniques of controlling nature perfected over 1,000 years. Was it because they lived in lands so regularly rocked by earthquakes and natural calamities that they sought to tame the world around them? My eyes move to the sitting room, and then she looks at the bonsai tree and she thinks, well, if that isn't artificial, what is? Such fascinating debates pepper the novel. It's a novel of ideas as well as a novel of beautiful writing. I think that's one of the things that some of us have enjoyed so much. One reviewer even referred to the garden Aritomo has created over so many years as a capacious symbol of the human soul. I thought that was a bit daring. I wouldn't quite know what to say if somebody said, what do you mean after that sentence? And the novel itself makes a parallel between the human soul and the garden. As Twan claims in his essay on the Japanese garden, which is appearing in a book by Fiden, I think, he says, don't print it, but you can quote it, because they're very sticky on copyright. It's just about to come out. And he says, we borrow not only from our own memories, but also from the memories of people around us. And it isn't only memories that create the borrowed scenery or the chaquet of our lives, but everything we see and hear and experience, everyone we meet and talk to, and who talks to us. We borrow from music we listen to, from the books we read. We borrow from the past and the present. We borrow from the future, those far mountains we will one day reach. We borrow all these into our lives, and they form the ever-changing landscape in which we travel day after day. Chaquet, then, is a very important principle in which they move and have their being. Another important theme, which I mentioned earlier, is time. There's a lovely sentence, what he calls a pretty sentence. I'm not sure pretty is the right word, but it's an elegant sentence. Time seems, this is a sentence from the book, time seems to overlap like the shadow of leaves pressing down on other leaves, layer upon layer. And another sentence from the book, a garden borrows from the earth, the sky, and everything around it. But you, she says to Aritomo, you borrow from time. Your memories are a form of chaquet too. You bring them in to make your life here feel less empty. Well, of course, going with that theme is the one of deception and illusion, because a garden is to some extent an illusion. I mean, this reflecting the scenery into the pond is an illusion, and yet it also exists as scenery. And the garden itself, she says, has a time scheme, which, of course, if you're a gardener, even if you're not, you will know the garden, which is slightly upset, of course, when you import plants, because then there's a certain disturbance on the part of the plant, if you like. There's an adaptation of the plant. A garden, extract 9, is composed of a variety of clocks, Aritomo had once told me. Some of them run faster than the others, and some of them move slower than we can ever perceive. I only understood this fully long after I had been his apprentice. Every single plant and tree at Ugiri grew, flowered, and died at its own rate. Have you ever thought about that? How extraordinary it is that the crocuses know when to come up. I mean, sometimes they don't, of course. I mean, if we have a particularly mild winter, we get camellias in December, whereas I'm used to having them in January. That's the middle of our winter. And so, of course, it can be disturbed. But normally, I mean, given reasonably average conditions, these things come up at the right time. I mean, why do daffodils come after snowdrops? I thought my gardening knowledge was going to desert me at that point, but that's right, isn't it? Daffodils come after snowdrops. So it has these varieties of clocks. So every single plant and tree at Ugiri grew, flowered, and died at his own rate. Yet there was also a feeling of timelessness wrapped around it. The trees from a colder world, the oaks, the maples, and the cedars, had adjusted to the constant rains and mists, to the seasonless passing of time in the mountains. The turning of their colours was muted. Only the maple, and you see several maples in that picture, only the maple growing by the house remembered the changing seasons in the expanding circles of its memory. Its leaves had turned completely red, flaking away from the branches to drift across the garden. And then, finally, that irresistible comparison that I'm sure I've made with every book we've talked about this week, the Garden of Eden. It was Magnus, she said, who first told me the story of of the Garden of Evening. It's Frederick talking. And it's his uncle Magnus who's first told him the story. I had great difficulty imagining it, he remarked. A garden where nothing dies or decays, when no one grows old and the seasons never change? How miserable. Well, I don't think so. I think it'd be lovely if it was summer all. What do you think I feel like being here in the middle of our winter? It's wonderful. I say bring on the summer all the time. What's so miserable about that, Youngling asks. Think of the seasons as pieces of the finest, most translucent silk of different colours. Individually they are beautiful, but lay one on top of another, even if just along their edges, and something special is created. The narrow strip of time when the start of one season overlaps the other. And we do know that, don't we? When just, especially in England, when you've had a harsh winter and spring is just beginning with those snowdrops. And his concluding remark, when she asks, when he says, is it all still there, the Garden of Eden, unchanged? And I tried to recall, she couldn't, and he says, when the first man and first woman were banished from their home, i.e. the Garden of Eden, time was also set loose upon the world. So it does make you think, this book. It's an interesting book because it's not just about gardening by any means. Another main theme also is that of forgetting, of memory and forgetting. And there are two statues in Magnus's garden. And she says, what are they? A pair, extract 8, a pair of marble statues stood on their own plinths in the centre of the lawn, facing one another. And he says, bought them ridiculously cheap from an old planter's wife, after the planter ran off with a 15-year-old lover, said Magnus. The one on the right is Meaulnes. You've heard of her. The goddess of memory, I said. Who's the other woman? Her twin sister, of course, forgetting. The goddess of forgetting. I looked at him wondering if he was pulling my leg. I don't recall there's a goddess for that, she says. Ah, doesn't the fact of your not recalling prove her existence? He's quite entertaining, isn't he? He grinned. Maybe she exists, but it's just that we have forgotten. So what is her name? He shrugged, showing me his empty palms. You see, we don't even remember her name anymore. I meant to Google it and didn't. Has she got a name? They're not completely identical, I said, and one of them has a proper face, memory, and the other has a blurred face. Which one would you say is the older twin? Said Magnus. Meaulnes, of course. Really? She looks younger, don't you think? And Yunling says, memory must exist before there's forgetting. I smiled at him. Oh, have you forgotten that? So it's not all sort of grim Japanese stuff, I assure you. They're constant motives, then, memory and forgetting, throughout the time scheme. In this time scheme, which forces the reader to remember, yet shows the need to forget. There are a lot of things that Magnus has to forget, a lot of things that she has to forget, and yet the book is full of memories. Even Yunling's condition, aphasia, the reason she took earlier retirement, you remember, is a kind of forgetting of a particularly cruel kind. And there's a wonderful passage which I haven't got time to read, extract 10, I have become a collapsing star, pulling everything around it, even the light, into an ever-expanding void. And she says, once I lose all ability to communicate with the world outside myself, nothing will be left but what I remember. Very moving passage, I think. The garden also highlights another theme, the need for endurance, the tasks which Aritomo sets her, her own survival of prisoner of war camp, and particularly in that setting of stones period, I think, experience of her having to actually heave these terrible rocks into position. Aritomo even forces her to take off the glove from her left hand to expose her two mutilated fingers. So he's not going to let her forget. I think perhaps he feels that by accepting it, she might get over it more quickly. Well, this relationship, which begins in great hate ends in great love, and she is completely devastated when Aritomo walks off into the mountains. Only some of these cross-cultural complexities will actually, in the end, concern us, but it is a book full of them. In the end, I'm left with the feeling in this novel that we cannot know precisely the truth of any situation. I mean, particularly with a character like Aritomo, who is such a mixture. Was he a saint? Was he a devil? Was he an evil man? Was he a good man? It's a very intriguing book, and it, like the author himself, refuses to give you a straight answer. And I think that's one of the interests of it, that you have to work it out for yourself. And the man who released her or helped her to escape from the prisoner of war camp, Tominaga, is he a villain? Is he a saint? Neither. They're refined men. It's a particular Japanese type that he is painting in this book and in his first book, A Gift of Rain. The book, in its long span of years, because it does span those years from 41 to 87, and its wide range of characters, is a palimpsest, I think, a rich tapestry of human existence, not inviting us to judge, but to wonder at the characters' variety, their unpredictability, Yunling and Aritomo's in particular. But how to end a talk on such a wonderfully rich book, which starts with a quite magical passage placing the events to follow in the realm of myth. I mean, it does seem to me that this is almost a fairy story when you start reading it. And if you look at extract 13, on a mountain above the clouds once lived a man who had been the gardener of the Emperor of Japan. Not many people would have known of him before the war, but I did. He had left his home on the rim of the sunrise to come to the central highlands of Malaya. I was 17 years old when my sister first told me about him. A decade would pass before I travelled up to the mountain to see him. He did not apologize for what his countrymen had done to my sister and me, not on that rain-scratched morning when we first met, nor at any other time. What words could have healed any pain returned my sister to me? None. And he understood that. Not many people did. That's the beginning. And of course, I'm going to cheat, because how can you possibly end except with his own brilliant, enigmatic ending to the book, extract 14. Even as I am losing myself, Yunling writes, the garden will come back to life again. I will work in the garden, and I will visit Frederick. We will talk and laugh and weep like only old friends can. And in the evenings I will walk in the hills. Our Cheong, that's the servant, will be waiting at the front door, holding out Aritomo's walking stick to me. I will take it, of course. But I know there will come one day when I will tell him that I do not want it, which of course is what Aritomo has said the day that he walks off into the forest and never comes back. Before me lies a voyage of 1,000,000 miles, and memory is the moonlight I will borrow to illuminate my way. The lotus flowers are opening in the first rays of the sun. Tomorrow's rain lies on the horizon, but high up in the air, something pale and small is descending, growing in size as it falls. I watch the heron circle the pond, a leaf spiraling down to the water, setting off silent ripples across the garden. Thank you.